Talk about the creepiest cosmic graveyard, Mars. A red planet that has been beckoning us for more than a century. A planet on which we dream of founding a colony. And it is already littered with the wreckage of our attempts to get to it. Mars is a real graveyard of ambitions. Of the more than 50 missions to Mars, less than half were successful. The rest turned into space debris or crashed on the Martian surface. Imagine this picture. You're standing on Mars. Around you is a red desert that stretches to the horizon. And if you could go around the entire planet, you'd stumble upon a whole graveyard of spacecraft. Here lies the Soviet Mars 3, the first device that made a soft landing on Mars in 1971. It worked for only 14 seconds, transmitting an indistinct signal, and fell silent forever. Next to him is his twin Mars 6, which crashed during landing. A little further on is the British Beagle 2, which successfully landed in 2003 but was never able to deploy its solar panels and died in silence before it could even signal that it was intact. But the creepiest sight on Mars is the wreckage of Schiaparelli. It was a European lander that was supposed to land softly on the surface in 2016. Something went wrong with the computer. The device decided that it was already on the surface when in fact it was at an altitude of several kilometers. The engines turned off. Schiaparelli fell like a stone. It crashed into the Martian ground at a speed of more than 300 kilometers per hour and exploded, leaving a black spot on the surface and scattering debris hundreds of meters around. Orbiters photographed the crash site. The pictures show a dark spot from the explosion and a white. This is a parachute which remained lying on the red sand. And there are also rovers on Mars. Yes, some of them are still working, but many are already dead. Spirit, a rover that operated 6 times longer than planned, was stuck in a sand trap in 2009. Engineers have been trying to free him for months, but to no avail. The Martian winter covered him. The solar panels were covered with dust. The temperature dropped so much that the electronics simply froze. The last signal from Spirit came on March 22, 2010. Since then, there has been silence. He's still standing there in this sand trap in the middle of the Martian desert. Its twin, Opportunity, lasted until 2018 when a Martian dust storm covered the entire planet. The storm was so strong that sunlight could not break through the dust. Opportunity's batteries are dead. Engineers sent wake-up commands more than 1,000 times. There was no answer. Somewhere in the Perseverance Valley, it still stands, covered in Martian dust, a silent monument to human perseverance. But do you know what is really scary? Not the dead machines themselves, but the fact that sometimes they show signs of life. In 2014, the Opportunity rover, which was thought to be almost dead after a long winter, suddenly came to life. In 2007, after several months of silence, the Soviet spacecraft Phobos 2, which was in orbit around Mars, unexpectedly got in touch. However, after a few days, he fell silent again forever. It's like the voices of ghosts in the void. Now let's talk about Venus, the most hellish planet in the solar system. If Mars is a cold desert, then Venus is literally hell. The temperature on the surface is about 470 degrees Celsius. The atmospheric pressure is 90 times greater than the Earth's, as at a depth of almost a kilometer underwater. The atmosphere consists of sulfuric acid. This is a place where lead melts and spacecraft die in a matter of minutes. The USSR was obsessed with Venus. Soviet engineers sent probes there over and over again, trying to land them on the surface. The first attempts were catastrophic. Venera, The 3 in 1966 became the first man-made object to reach another planet, but it crashed because communication with it was lost long before entering the atmosphere. Venera 4 was crushed by the monstrous pressure before it even reached the surface. Venera 5 and Venera 6 suffered the same fate. But the Soviet engineers did not give up. They built more and more durable devices, real titanium spheres capable of withstanding the pressure of the Venusian atmosphere. And finally, in 1970, Venera 7 did the impossible. It landed on the surface and transmitted data for 23 minutes. 23 minutes in hell. Then it melted and fell silent forever. Subsequent Soviet Venus worked a little longer, up to 2 hours. They even managed to take a few photos. These pictures show rocks covered with some kind of dark crust and a yellowish sky. These are the only photos from the surface of a planet other than Mars. And these photos were taken by dead vehicles that are now lying on the scorching surface of Venus, slowly collapsing in a hellish atmosphere. In total, the remains of more than 24 spacecraft lie on Venus. Soviet Venus and Vega, American pioneers. They're all dead. All of them slowly dissolve in sulfuric acid and melt under a monstrous temperature. This is the hottest cemetery in the solar system. And now, let's go back to space, into the cold void between the planets, because it is there that the most terrible graves are located. I'm talking about cosmonauts and astronauts who died in space and whose bodies remain there. Vladimir Komarov, whom I have already talked about, at least returned to Earth. But there were others. In 1971, cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev became crew members of the Salyut 1 orbital station. They spent 23 days on the station, setting a record for staying in space. Everything was going well. They returned home as heroes. But during the descent, something went wrong. The ventilation valve opened prematurely. At an altitude of more than 100 kilometers, air began to escape from the capsule. The cosmonauts tried to close the valve manually, but it was located in such a way that it was impossible to reach it without unfastening the belts. And it took time to unfasten the belts and try to close the valve, time that they did not have. The pressure in the capsule dropped rapidly. A few seconds later, they lost consciousness. A minute later, they were dead. The capsule continued to descend on autopilot. When the search team opened the hatch, they found 3 bodies. On the faces of the cosmonauts, there were traces of blood from the noses and ears. Their eyes were open. They died in space, although technically their bodies returned to Earth. But the most terrible story is associated with the disaster of the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003. 7 astronauts were returning home after a successful mission. When entering the atmosphere at a speed of more than 20,000 kilometers per hour, the shuttle began to break up. The heat shielding tiles were damaged during takeoff, but no one knew how seriously. Hot plasma began to penetrate into the wing. The shuttle became uncontrollable. It exploded into pieces at an altitude of about 60 kilometers. The astronauts were alive when the shuttle began to break up. They were conscious. Investigators found evidence that some of them tried to activate emergency systems. This means that they understood what was happening. They knew they were dying. Their bodies fell from the sky along with the wreckage of the shuttle, scattered for hundreds of kilometers across Texas and Louisiana. It took months for rescuers to collect the remains. Some fragments were never found. And what about the Challenger disaster in 1986? 7 astronauts, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, soared under the gaze of millions. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle exploded. For a long time, it was believed that the crew died instantly. But the investigation revealed something terrifying. The cockpit survived the explosion. It did not collapse. It just broke away from the rest of the shuttle and started falling. The astronauts were alive. Some of them managed to activate their personal oxygen reserves, which means that they were conscious. They fell for almost 3 minutes from a height of 15 kilometers. 3 minutes to realize that you are dying. The cabin crashed into the ocean at a speed of more than 300 kilometers per hour. The impact was so strong that it was tantamount to colliding with a concrete wall. But there are even more terrible stories. Stories that have never been officially confirmed, but are whispered in the corridors of space agencies. The story of the lost cosmonauts, Soviet cosmonauts who allegedly died in space before Yuri Gagarin, but these missions were never officially reported. The Giudica Cordilla brothers, Italian radio amateurs, claimed in the late 1950s and early 1960s that they had intercepted signals from Soviet spacecraft. In November 1960, they recorded an SOS signal in Russian. In February 1961, the sounds of a rapid heartbeat, which then slowed down and stopped. In May 1961, a female voice in Russian shouted about entering the atmosphere, that it was getting hot, that the ship was on fire. Then there was silence. The USSR denied these recordings, but the fact remains, many Soviet cosmonauts were crossed out of the official lists of the Cosmonaut Corps without explanation. Valentin Bondarenko died during training in a hyperbaric chamber in 1961. His death was reported only in 1986. Grigory Nelyubov was expelled from the Cosmonaut Corps for drunkenness and later died after being hit by a train. But some believe that he managed to fly into space and something went wrong. Are these stories true? We'll probably never know. But the very possibility that somewhere in space the bodies of unknown astronauts, whose names have been erased from history, are drifting is particularly terrifying. And now let's talk about the most distant cosmic graveyard, the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. They are among millions of stone debris. Several spacecraft are drifting. Japan's Hayabusa barely made it back in 2010, but its predecessors weren't as lucky. Farther away, beyond the orbit of Jupiter, lie even more distant graves. Galileo is an American probe that studied Jupiter and its moons from 1995 to 2003. When its mission ended, NASA decided to destroy the spacecraft, sending it into the atmosphere of Jupiter. Why? Because Galileo had a radioisotope battery on board, and there was a risk that someday, many years from now, the spacecraft could fall on the moon Europa, which may have life in the subglacial ocean. In order not to pollute the potential living world with terrestrial microorganisms, the Galileo was sent to its death. It entered Jupiter's atmosphere at a speed of almost 50 kilometers per second and burned up in a matter of seconds. The same thing happened with the Cassini probe in 2017. For 13 years, he studied Saturn, its rings and moons. He made amazing discoveries, geysers on Enceladus, methane lakes on Titan. But when the fuel ran out, it too was sent to its death, sent into Saturn's atmosphere. Cassini transmitted data until the last second, and then burned up, becoming part of the planet it studied. This is a special kind of space burial, deliberate destruction to protect other worlds from pollution. Strange, isn't it? We build these incredible machines, send them on a journey of billions of kilometers. They serve us for years, and then we intentionally kill them by burning them in the atmospheres of alien planets. But the most distant graves are outside the solar system. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 are the only man-made objects that have left our solar system. They were launched in 1977 and are still in operation, although their systems are gradually shutting down one by one. But what happens when they finally die? They will continue to drift in interstellar space. In tens of thousands of years, they will fly past other stars. Millions of years from now, they will still be flying through the void, dead and cold, carrying gold plates with a message from humanity, a message from a civilization that may not exist by then. These will be the most enduring monuments to humanity. Not pyramids, not statues, but two small spacecraft flying through eternity. Now let's talk about orbital space debris. It's a real graveyard around the Earth. There, in orbit, debris of more than 9,000 tons of space debris is flying. This is not just a number. These are tens of thousands of objects larger than 10 centimeters and millions of small fragments. Among them are fragments of satellites, entire dead satellites, rocket upper stages, instruments lost by astronauts during spacewalks. In 2009, the first ever collision of two satellites in orbit occurred. The Russian military satellite Cosmos 2251, dead and uncontrollable, crashed into a working American commercial satellite, Iridium-33. The collision occurred at an altitude of about 800 kilometers above Siberia, at a speed of more than 11 kilometers per second. Both satellites shattered into thousands of fragments. This debris now flies in orbit, posing a danger to other satellites and space stations. And in 2021, Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon, destroying its own old satellite. One explosion, and another 1,500 fragments flying at the speed of a bullet. Astronauts on the ISS had to take refuge in descent capsules in case one of the debris pierced the station. Imagine, you are in space in a thin-walled module, and thousands of debris are flying around you at a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour. Even a tiny pea-sized fragment at this speed has the energy of a grenade. A direct hit on a space station or an astronaut spacesuit during a spacewalk would be catastrophic. And this problem will only get worse. Scientists talk about Kessler syndrome, a cascading reaction when collisions create more and more debris that causes new collisions. At some point, low Earth orbit could become so clogged that spaceflight would become too dangerous. We may find ourselves trapped on our own planet, surrounded by a cloud of dead satellites and their debris. Among all this garbage, there are especially creepy objects. For example, lost tools. In 2008, astronaut Heidemarie Stephanischen Piper dropped a bag of instruments worth about $100,000 during a spacewalk from the International Space Station. The bag flew into space. For several months, it could be seen from Earth through amateur telescopes. A bright that was once someone's work inventory and now has become space junk. Eventually, it entered the atmosphere and burned up. In 1965, astronaut Edward White lost his glove during the first American spacewalk. The spacesuit glove became the most expensive space debris of its time. It flew in orbit for about a month, moving at a speed of about 28,000 kilometers per hour before it burned up in the atmosphere. Imagine a glove flying in the emptiness of space. A terrible sight if you think about it. Now let's go back to the moon and talk about what the American astronauts left there during the Apollo program. These are not just flags and footprints. This is a whole cemetery of human activity. 6 landers remained on the moon, the lower stages that served as launch pads for the return of astronauts to orbit. They still stand there, on their legs, slowly covered with micrometeorite dust. Next to them are 3 lunar mobiles, electric cars that astronauts drove on the lunar surface. They stand where they were last left. The batteries are long dead. The rubber of the wheels has probably collapsed from cosmic radiation and extreme temperature changes. But they're still there. Can you imagine? Cars on the moon. They just stand in the moon dust, as if in some abandoned parking lot. The astronauts left a lot of other things there. Scientific instruments, some of which worked for years after people flew away. Tools, bags of human excrement. Yes, it's true. They left bags of waste to reduce their weight on takeoff, cameras, flags, plaques, medals of the dead astronauts. One of the most touching objects on the moon is a small aluminum figurine called the Fallen Astronaut. It was left by the crew of Apollo 15 in 1971 in memory of all the astronauts and cosmonauts who died in the space race. Next to the figurine is a plaque with the names of 14 people, 8 Americans and 6 Soviet cosmonauts. This is a small monument on the surface of the moon that no one ever visits. And there is also a family photo on the moon. Astronaut Charles Duke from the Apollo 16 crew left a photo of his family in a plastic bag on the lunar surface. He himself told about it later. Imagine a family photo on the moon. By now, it's probably faded from the sun's ultraviolet light beyond recognition, but it's still there. A strange, slightly sad artifact of human sentimentality on a dead world. Let's now talk about more modern space cemeteries. About the so-called space cemetery in the Pacific Ocean. Officially, it is called Point Nemo, the farthest place from any land on Earth. It is located in the South Pacific Ocean at a distance of more than 2,500 kilometers from the nearest coast. And it was there that end-of-life space stations and large satellites were dropped for decades. At the bottom of the ocean in the area of Point Nemo lie the wreckage of more than 300 spacecraft. The remains of the Progress cargo ships, European ATV automatic cargo ships, and Japanese HDV trucks rest there. There are parts of Soviet and Russian space stations of the Salyut series. And the largest object in this underwater cemetery is the Mir orbital station. Mir was the pride of Soviet and Russian cosmonautics. It worked in orbit for 15 years, from 1986 to 2001. It was visited by cosmonauts from many countries. It was home to people in space. But by 2001, the station was outdated. It became more and more expensive and dangerous to maintain its work. It was decided to deorbit it. On March 23, 2001, Mir began its last journey. Special engines slowed down the station, and it began to descend. When it entered the dense layers of the atmosphere, a real fire show began. A 130-ton space station burning, breaking apart, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Most of the station burned up in the atmosphere, but large debris, about 1,500 fragments weighing about 20 tons, fell into the Pacific Ocean near Point Nemo. Oceanologists say that at a depth of several kilometers, in complete darkness and under monstrous pressure, lie the wreckage of a human home in space. Modules covered with shells and algae. The portholes through which the astronauts looked at the Earth and the stars now look into the eternal darkness of the ocean abyss. And soon another large object will join this debris. International Space Station. The ISS has been operating since 2000, but its service life is coming to an end. Sometime in the late 2020s or early 2030s, it too will be deorbited and sunk at Point Nemo. It will be the end of an era. The largest and most expensive object ever built by mankind in space weighing more than 400 tons, larger than a football field, will be a pile of debris at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And now let's talk about a completely different kind of space cemetery. About the cemetery of hopes and ambitions. There are numerous spacecraft that have been launched but never reached their destination. They didn't crash spectacularly, they just disappeared, lost in the void. Phobos Grunt is a Russian probe that in 2011 was supposed to go to the Martian satellite Phobos, take soil samples, and return to Earth. It was an ambitious mission that was supposed to restore the prestige of Russian cosmonautics. But immediately after separating from the rocket, something went wrong. The engines did not start. The device remained in low Earth orbit. Engineers tried to contact him, give commands, revive him. Unsuccessfully. For 2 weeks, Phobos Grunt was silent, slowly losing altitude. And then it entered the atmosphere and fell into the Pacific Ocean. The mission, worth billions of rubles, turned into a pile of debris at the bottom of the ocean, never reaching Earth orbit. The Japanese probe Nozomi was supposed to be the first Japanese device in orbit around Mars. It was launched in 1998. For 5 years, he flew to the Red Planet, overcoming technical problems one after another. But when it finally reached Mars in 2003, it turned out that there wasn't enough fuel to get into orbit. Nozomi flew past Mars and went into orbit around the sun somewhere out there in the cosmic void. He is still flying, dead, silent, forever doomed to circle the sun without completing his mission. The British probe Beagle 2, which I have already mentioned, is a particularly tragic story. In 2003, it successfully landed on Mars, but there was no communication. For more than 10 years, nothing was known about him. It was believed that it crashed. But in 2015, the orbiter was able to photograph the landing site with high resolution. The Beagle 2 was there, safe and sound. It's just that its solar panels didn't fully open. They blocked the antenna. The device worked, but could not transmit a signal. He was lying on Mars, perhaps trying to call for help, but no one could hear him. And at some point, the batteries died, and he died in silence, just a few centimeters from success. It's especially cruel, isn't it? When the device has almost completed its mission, almost succeeded, but some tiny technical glitch turns it into another piece of space debris. But let's talk about the darkest prospect, about what awaits us in the future if we really start colonizing other planets. Because there will definitely be real cemeteries on Mars or the Moon, real graves with human bodies. If we establish permanent bases on the Moon or Mars, people will die there. From accidents, from diseases, from old age, if the colony exists long enough. And they cannot be sent back to Earth. Transportation is too expensive. The bodies will have to be buried there. How are people buried on the Moon? Is it possible to just dig a hole in lunar regolith? But there is no air, no bacteria. Bodies will not decompose. They will lie in a vacuum, mummified, forever preserved. Or will they be cremated? But cremation requires oxygen, and oxygen on the Moon is more expensive than gold. And on Mars? There is an atmosphere there, albeit rarefied. But it is so cold and dry that the bodies will also mummify instead of decomposing. Imagine a Martian graveyard, rows of tombstones in red dust. The names of the first settlers who lived and died on an alien planet, millions of kilometers from home, who have never seen rain, never felt the wind, never walked on the grass. And these people will definitely be there. If we are serious about colonizing space, we must accept the fact that we will create cemeteries on other worlds, that some of our descendants will be buried not on Earth, but on another planet. That their graves would look not at the earthly sky, but at someone else's, where the earth is just a bright dot among the stars. Do you know what's the creepiest thing about space cemeteries? Their eternity. On Earth, everything is temporary. Monuments are destroyed, graves are overgrown, even pyramids slowly disintegrate under the influence of wind and rain. But there is no wind in space. No rain. There is no erosion other than the slow impact of micrometeorites and cosmic radiation. The shoe footprint left by Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969 is still there. It will be there for millions of years to come until some meteorite accidentally falls into this very place. The flags that the astronauts planted on the moon probably faded from the sun's ultraviolet light, turning into white rags, but they still stand.